Hi, Jerry here. In today's video, I'm going to be designing a launch system to get 42 tons of payload into orbit. As with my previous launch system, I'm going to be first setting up a payload. In this case, it's going to be basically an orbital fuel depot that I can later use to refuel ships in orbit or drag the whole depot around to other parts of the Kerbin system for exploration. And I'm going to be once again attempting to use a thrust-to-weight ratio of about 20 kilonewtons per ton when the rocket is full of fuel. That's because I believe that will be a fairly efficient thrust-to-weight ratio for launching a rocket off the surface of Kerbin. It seemed to work fairly well last time, so I'll be doing that again. And 42 tons happens to be the mass which is the largest mass conveniently lifted by a mainsail using that system. I'll have underneath my payload a mainsail engine on a stack with another one of those large gray fuel tanks to provide fuel for the engine. I will not be using any of the fuel in the payload since that would defeat the purpose of sending it into orbit. I'm planning to use asparagus staging system. That's where you have pairs of liquid fuel boosters with each pair feeding fuel into the next pair and finally into the main stack. That's one of the most efficient ways that you can build a rocket in Kerbal Space Program. In the real world, it doesn't tend to look quite as attractive because the amount of pumps that you need, well, those end up weighing quite a bit if you want to start pumping enough fuel to make a difference for large rockets. And they can also break, and people building rockets in the real world really don't want them to break. When my rocket breaks, I will have to go back and spend 5 minutes doing it again. If a real rocket breaks, that costs a tremendous amount of money. Now, I'm hoping, speaking of rockets breaking, that I will be able to use liquid fuel boosters based around skipper engines. And the reason for that is the more powerful mainsail engine has a tendency to break booster rockets off. It just provides so much power that when you have it throttled up, sometimes your structure just can't handle it. And figuring out how to put struts on to reinforce it and make it stay in one piece can sometimes take quite a while. The skipper engine provides 650 kilonewtons of thrust, which is enough to lift 32.5 tons in my system. The skipper engine itself weighs 4 tons, so that's 28.5 tons left. So what I'm going to do for the boosters is I'm going to use one of the large gray fuel tanks and one of the tanks that's half that size, which together mass a total of 27 tons. Now, I don't actually know if this will be enough fuel to get me into orbit. That's why I've got a test payload here, so I can actually try it. I haven't built this rocket before. And theoretically, I should be adding struts in between my skipper engines, but as you'll see here, I'm going to completely forget to do that. Now, this is likely to cause some trouble, as without struts, rockets are quite prone to wobbling around, and that wobble is more than just cosmetic. It actually does reduce your fuel efficiency quite a bit, because you end up with your engines pointing in directions other than the one you're trying to go, and while they're still more or less lined up, it does mean you're thrusting in less than optimal directions. Okay, time to try out this design. Now, I did just do the math on wobbling, and it turns out you only lose about 1.5% efficiency from being out by 10 degrees. Being out by 20 degrees will get you about a 6% reduction. Of course, the trouble with wobble is if you ignore it, you can quickly find yourself out by much larger amounts, like 180 degrees, and that of course completely breaks your energy budget. And I would really like this rocket to be easy to fly, and constantly having to fight with the controls as I'm doing during this launch is not easy to fly. So it does seem to be getting into orbit on the whole. If I get some struts put on here, I think it should be a fairly straightforward process to get it into orbit. And as I'm getting it up, I've got up to 80 kilometer apoapsis here, so I cut my engines and drift up to the correct altitude where I'll begin to circularize the orbit. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm sort of keeping half an eye on my remaining fuel, and it looks good. I've got 1600 liters left of liquid fuel, and there's something important about that number that I haven't quite noticed yet, and don't notice even as I'm glancing through this ship while I was playing the game. Now it's pretty obvious to me as I'm doing commentary. I completely missed something very important against that dark background that I would not have missed had I been doing this on the daytime. Now, the orbit is, once again, as with my last video, I overshot by about 30 kilometers, which out of 80 kilometers really isn't very good accuracy, but I suppose if you look at the velocity change, it's not actually that much, so I'll just get around here and start circularizing. I still have fuel left in my tanks, which is always a good sign, since I won't need much more to get my orbit fully circular. And as I'm just setting up this maneuver, I'm feeling quite pleased with myself. I think the rocket has worked just fine. The rocket got built without having to use any mainsail engines aside from the one in the main stack, which should lead to better structural stability because the mainsails have a tendency to break things. And yeah, everything looks to be completely good here. Got a circular orbit, have fuel to spare, and no. I have failed completely. The mainsail engine has in fact broken the rocket in half. I don't even know where the payload ended up, but it clearly is not in orbit. So back to the drawing board. I'm going to need some struts and probably a little bit more fuel. Okay, the plan is to add a little bit more fuel, a lot more struts, and perhaps a few control surfaces as well. Maybe add some tail fins and some reaction wheels, along with some radioisotope generators to power the reaction wheels. Now, one thing that's useful to keep in mind with building struts and reinforcing a rocket, if you need to do something like reinforce the two sections of a single tower, then what you need to do is put something on the side, because you cannot reinforce with struts objects that are in parallel very easily. The struts, well, they simply can't be placed like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a couple cubic octagonal struts around that main stack, and I'm going to use those as a point to attach some struts. And with that, it should be stable enough that I will not have the rocket breaking in half as I did last time. Okay, let's try this again. As I launch the rocket once more, I find my control systems make liftoff go much more smoothly, so that's a nice change. And unfortunately, as we get up to orbit here, we're just burning fuel a little bit too fast. And as I get up to a suborbital trajectory, well, there's just not going to be quite enough left to actually circularize the orbit. That main tank really isn't going to last very long with a mainsail on it. Maybe a nuclear engine would get a high enough efficiency to circularize, but this rocket design is just plain going to need more fuel. And if you'd like to see me do that, come back for part 2 when I finally resigned myself to needing a mainsail engine for some of my liquid fuel boosters, and do a little bit of crashing and burning before actually getting the rocket to work.